Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the variety of news items we have for you, the dangers of buying medication online, and particularly from unregulated sources. The possible concerns, and albeit somewhat delayed and late to the game concerns, the bird flu could be the next pandemic. The COVID-19 lab leak hypothesis gains at least somewhat more traction. A bird flu vaccine, not just for humans, but for cattle and birds as well. A statue in Italy has started weeping, and we'll go through the various requirements to debunk this. Denmark has started recalling a number of brands of ramen, particularly Korean ramen, as it is too spicy and therefore considered a poison. Rasmussen has gone right over the cliff into the world of crazy with various claims about COVID-19, the vaccine, and, unfortunately, their polling, which effectively is nonsense. And Taylor Swift fans have set off seismic detectors, effectively being mistaken for an earthquake during her concerts in 3 different cities in different countries. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Starting with ozempic and diabetes. The Daily Mail has an article which fundamentally explains how a woman bought her ozempic online due to the unfortunate increase in demand and the relative shortfall in supply. This of course means that buying it from somewhere online, you could be getting anything and everything, and that's pretty much what happened here. The package that she ordered arrived and nothing seemed quite right. The packaging was wrong, the actual product looked different, and obviously after everything was said and done, it behaved very differently. So the question is, what actually happened? And this is where things get a little bit murky. It appears that she was sent an insulin pen. Now, insulin and ozempic are similar, but they are not the same, and it's very important to be clear about it. Insulin is specifically intended to activate the insulin receptors in the body and cause various cells to take up the glucose that is floating in the bloodstream. Ozempic doesn't quite do that. What Ozempic does is it regulates parts of the process involved in glucose metabolism. Yes, in the end result is somewhat similar, but the mechanisms are very different, and that's important here. Insulin, instead of Ozempic, can cause a sudden drop in blood glucose levels, causing hypoglycemia, that is, too little blood sugar. And as a result, you can have rather unfortunate side effects, like death. If you were to think of this in a more, let's say, practical scenario, that is, if you were to compare the functionality of the two, in this instance, rather than getting the somewhat longer term increase in insulin production or secretion, which is what Ozempic should do, you are getting a sudden and massive increase in the amount of insulin in the body immediately. And that of course means you get instant results. Which of course, if you're doing this, say for example to lose weight or just to control your diabetes, isn't what you want. It can be overcome. For example, if somebody is hypoglycemic, they can consume something like jelly beans, lollies, something that's full of sugar and very easily absorbed, and this will counteract that insulin effect. But you don't want to be in a position where you are trying to balance the wrong drug. When you're in that situation, things have already gone south and you need to stop it from getting any worse, not try and fix it. This brings us to why it happened, and quite simply, they bought what could be described as a scam product online. It was sold as one thing, and another thing got shipped instead, and this leads to the current situation, and fundamentally why rather than relying on rather questionable if not outright dodgy websites and suppliers online, go through those that are trusted and reliable. More so when, we have the current situation of the official products being in limited supply due to a surge in demand, but not a corresponding surge in supply. Further, depending on just how you've sourced your particular, let's say, off-brand product, you may also be giving the seller more information than just your credit card. Depending on what you've provided to get it, you may be giving up a lot of personal health information, your personal data, for example, age, address, full name, and more. And then you also have the issue of they have your credit card details or whatever you've chosen to pay with, which could mean that you suddenly find that there's another version of yourself out there running up debts like crazy, and you have to prove that it wasn't you, if not worse again. In further medical news, although this time at least somewhat more trustworthy, it's a mouse model again that's looking at contraceptives, but also this time male contraceptives. This is by no means the only example. In fact, in the last few weeks we've mentioned a couple of these male contraceptives that are intended to deal with the, well, let's say imbalance between the availability of these for males and females. The key thing here is not just that, well, it's another contraceptive, but that it's a different mechanism and a different compound, which does mean that even if one of these companies does manage to start selling it, and let's be clear about it, it's a big if at the moment, there is a possibility that there would be competing products. So even with a patent in place for one or more, there should still be a significant lowering in price, which would be good if this ever happens, remembering that there is a massive if. Now, unlike others that we've mentioned, this compound, which is called CDD-2807, was made in America, whereas the other was not, and this was an injection that was given once, and it provided the, sterility for 21 days. This is good, as that also means that it is reversible. However, some of the recipient mice, let's say, did remain sterile for up to 53 days, which is a concern. That means you're going to have a fair degree of uncertainty in how long it will last, which is a problem, but also what's going to happen if, for example, you trusted it to last for just 21 days, and instead, at the end of that 21 days, you got a second dose, but you were still sterile. Are you going to find that this continues to stack up and eventually you are permanently sterile? That's the big question here. But nonetheless, this is still a good thing. On the other hand, though, this may not ever actually pass through, mostly down to the fact that previous attempts to do something similar in the last few years, it was about 2016 from memory, basically got halted because, in part, it was causing sterility when it was meant to be reversible, and by that we mean you could not reverse the sterility issue. There were issues around a individual self-deleting, and of course the fact that there are a range of other side effects. Side effects that, yes, are present in the female birth control, the oral contraceptive, but that was approved in a time when there were, well, more liberal rules and regulations around drugs. That's why some of the modern antipsychotics are not as effective as those that are really old, but they're used because they don't have the very nasty side effects of antipsychotics. For example, one of them can absolutely decimate and permanently ruin your immune system, but it works better than some of the modern antipsychotics. Admittedly, it's nowhere near as, benign as the female oral contraceptive, which is why that's not seen anywhere near as bad. But those same modern standards are why the male contraceptives are likely to be a long way off. Going to diseases next, we have, well, to no one's surprise, avian influenza, and the fact that, well, there is a certain amount of catch-up on the experts' part now, where they're finally admitting that this might be the next pandemic. Although, admittedly, the reason they've changed their view is due to certain developments, so it's not a small reason why they've shifted their opinion. Now, there are two strains of avian influenza that are circulating. Both of them are the H5N1 and the H5N2. Both are bad. However, what's important here is that they're both circulating in somewhat different areas. For example, the H5N1 was responsible for sea lions and seals dying off, whereas H5N2 was responsible for a lot of cow infections, particularly in Mexico as of last week. The concern now, though, is that not only do we have a number of individuals who've been infected, and there's about a 50% fatality rate in those that have been, but it's infected a child to start with. Now, typically, and let's be clear, we're talking about typically here, children tend to be somewhat more resilient to certain viral infections, and it's just down to how their immune system is. The second major development is that rodents are being infected, and this is something we've mentioned previously. For example, New York has birds full of it. Nearly every bird in New York has at some point been infected, it seems. It's a slight exaggeration, but nonetheless. The concern with New York is that, given that it is the rat king city, once one of those rodents are infected, they can bring this virus into the apartments that are very densely populated in New York, being, well, New York. And from that, humans will now be infected. So we have children being infected, rodents being able to bring it into homes, and it started mutating. Yeah, this is the COVID variant issue all over again. Mutated variants can, and generally will be, more concerning, if not the same level of concern. Rarely is it adverse to the virus, and that's for exactly the same reason most mutations, rarely, if we observe them, are adverse. And that's because if they are, they kill the host, so it doesn't get a chance to carry on and continue to effectively procreate. And finally, it's transmission. Unfortunately, the most recent cases have demonstrated coughing as a symptom, and it's influenza or the flu, meaning, well, unfortunately, they're going to spread it, because just like with COVID, droplets full of virus in this case, being inhaled by someone else, and suddenly you have more people infected, and it spreads. Unlike COVID, which had a relatively high rate of transmission, this is significantly more so, at least amongst modeling of it. So if it gets to anywhere near COVID, let alone the expected higher levels of transmission, shit's going to hit the fan really hard, really quick, and unless you duck, you're going to be covered in it. In other news related to experts, although this time it's research institutes, rather obviously the other concerns that we've mentioned, it's all about COVID, and unfortunately the lab leak theory has gained yet more evidence, which is a pretty big worry, and not just for the fact that, well, this is something that we haven't really had a definitive answer on, but also it's going to fan the flames of various conspiracy theories, amongst other concerns. Some of this is admittedly rather old news. To be clear about it, it's things we already know, it's just in a better contextual situation. And the article comes from the Genetic Literacy Project for the excerpt we found, but the full article's from the New York Times. The 5 reasons that the theory has gained greater traction is obviously the location. Wuhan is where you find the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Given that it's an Institute for Virology, they do a lot of research, including research on things like SARS, unfortunately. But that also owes to the fact that it's, well, China's major virus research institute. They'll be looking at SARS simply because that's a major viral concern. So this isn't necessarily new. But when you add to this the second concern, which is the period before the outbreak, and the genetic modification research that was going on, the research in particular, and let's be clear about it, it's not entirely clear what it is that they actually did, since China's been less than forthcoming, is that several proposals put forward modifying various viruses in such a way, very much what we see with COVID-19. So you have a SARS-CoV-2 defining features being proposed as the major research initiative. That is, we want to make these changes, and to a certain extent, there are various claims that we can observe these in the genome, although those particular arguments tend to be pretty controversial. So what we can rely on definitively is that there were proposals to make the same changes, not necessarily that we actually observe the same changes because of that research. Third is that The laboratory, or more accurately research institute, is notorious for its really poor biosafety practices, to be clear about it. In fact, calling them poor is at sometimes a generous description, mostly down to the fact that there is evidence that researchers would conduct their experiments and then sell off the animals to various local markets. Which brings us to the next point, which is a lack of evidence, not only for the unknown seafood market, but also for the fifth point, which is the wildlife trade issue. Both these points have a problem in that they can show that there was a virus there. They cannot demonstrate that that was the source of the virus. And that's a pretty big problem. We know that, at least in theory, there's a proposal for research of this kind at the Institute. We know the Institute has poor practices, and we can't say that it came from outside the Institute. This, of course, has only really breathed new life into the conspiracy theory, as there's no definitive answer. And again, this very much owes to the lack of transparency and cooperation from China. Or should we perhaps call it West Taiwan, given their recent shenanigans around that island. In other news related to COVID-19, we have the BMJ Public Health Journal, or British Medical Journal Public Health Journal. Let's just call it BMJ to make this easy. What they've done is publish an article, and the article is, to no one's surprise, given how much controversy it's generated, called Excess Mortality Across Countries in the Western World Since the COVID-19 Pandemic, Our World in Data Estimates of January 2020 to December 2022. Okay, that's a problem, mostly down to the fact that the article basically says, or is titled in such a way that you would misapprehend it to mean, actually, this is an indicator that vaccines were bad. But that's not what it says, to be clear about it. Unfortunately, various publications have taken it to mean the COVID-19 vaccine led to an increase in excess deaths, or basically an increase in people dying. And that's not the case. In fact, very clearly, it's not what it says. If you look at the data, and to be clear about it, it's important to look at the data because it's global data, and you start examining the number of excess deaths across the world and the number of confirmed cases of COVID-19, to be clear, along with the various rates of infection that should have been modeled alongside this if they were trying to do what they were saying, and the rollout of vaccines. But they didn't do that last step. All they looked at was the distribution of COVID-19 and the number of people dying. Now, that's the key thing here, and it's important to point out, they didn't actually attribute any of this mortality to the vaccines. They attributed it effectively to COVID-19. And what they are calling for, in all intents and purposes, is more research into the mortality rates and COVID-19, and possibly, vaguely, maybe other factors, which does include the vaccine, but it is not the vaccine in and of itself. People have basically attached some sort of significance to the rollout of the vaccine, which occurred well after the period in which they're investigating, which isn't justified in the publication itself. In short, if you were to look at this, you could basically say what happened during the pandemic and how many people died during it, not necessarily what caused that death. Now, it gets better because not just have people, at least in terms of modern media, completely misunderstood what's happening, but even the BMJ has had to issue a public statement outlining that, no, you've all completely misunderstood what it is that we published. As they've explained, various news outlets have taken a implied direct causal link between vaccinations and mortality. But to be clear, the readers have effectively implied this. The study itself does not establish anything like that, which shouldn't take a public statement from BMJ to understand, simply because it's very clear in the publication if you read it and actually know what it is you're reading. On the other hand, the same data set, if you were to take it as it is presented and understand the timeline of various releases of the vaccine, the practices in place in various countries, and correctly adjust for all these other variables, has the opposite effect. The vaccines lowered the excess mortality rate. It's almost a perfect example of the anti-vaxxer meme, and in some ways it's hilarious, simply because it's such a bad take. On the other hand, it perfectly demonstrates not just the anti-vaxxer playbook in practice, but also how it is that the media is contributing to further absolute mess of a situation by screwing up the most simple of things, and yet in turn amplifying complete misinformation. This is the same sort of nonsense we would honestly expect to see for the bird flu vaccines that are being rolled out as well. And to be clear, yes, there is actually a proposal to make a vaccine for avian influenza. Various states are already experiencing massive issues with this. Now, the problems are not just limited to birds, it's also going to affect the dairy industry as well. So you'll see that there's a shortcoming in the supply of chicken meat, eggs, to a certain extent if they're not careful, the possible source of some vaccines which are done by inoculating eggs with various viruses. Then you have a shortage in beef if beef cattle are infected, plus the dairy industry as a whole, so that's milk, cheese, yogurt, and more. Yeah, this is not just going to be a small issue. If this does break out the way it looks like it will, it's going to have a massive effect. What has been proposed at this stage is, in America, at least 5 million doses of the flu vaccine for the H5N1 variant. This is not so much different to the, say, 40 million doses the European Union has put on order. But in either case, this isn't enough. In fact, in America, for instance, just under 5 million doses isn't anywhere near what they need. They would need over 600 million doses. And that's because you need 2 doses, typically, to induce the necessary immunological response for something like avian influenza. And not just that, but then if you also want to vaccinate chickens, for example, cattle, and if you need to provide those who work in those industries with extra protection, yeah, 600 million doses isn't going near enough. Of course, it may just be that the 5 million doses that we've described are being prepared now using eggs, and that other methods, for example mRNA methods, or even using genetically modified bacteria to produce the antigens, are what's going to make up the remaining proportion that will be needed. And of course, the last issue is, even if, and this is the big if, you were able to take the current approach, that 5 million doses, and scale it up, you would need to take eggs that are currently being used specifically for the annual regular human influenza strains, and you would need to redirect them to the avian influenza strains, which puts more demand on an already very limited resource. To be clear, you can't just take any chicken egg and do this. They do need to be bred in specific situations, specialized facilities intended only for making eggs, and chickens for that matter, that are intended for this purpose. They're effectively treated the same way that you would treat, say, medical equipment. They go through very rigorous processes to ensure that not only are the chickens, but the eggs produced appropriate for the purpose and won't produce other problems. And this, of course, brings us to the idea of, well, if we have all of these nightmarish things out there, can't we just make one vaccine? And yes, that's currently being trialed. The clinical trials are primarily looking at giving the annual influenza and COVID-19 vaccines together. After all, avian influenza, although yes it occurs regularly, isn't an annual problem. It's more like every 5 to 10 years, nature decides to have another crack at trying to kill humanity by throwing avian influenza or some other disease at us, like SARS for instance. Thankfully, we haven't woken up anything particularly nasty from the glaciers, but give it time, humanity's trying. But in current, very relevant and very realistic expectations, we have Moderna's attempt to create a influenza and COVID-19 vaccine, And the idea is simply, well, if you have the annual influenza vaccine and you get both a northern and southern hemisphere variant, and the two are nearly always related, one following the other, you'll find that you can effectively provide 2 vaccines a year, and 2 vaccines a year that are typically well taken up by most of the population, but particularly the population that is most vulnerable, those being very elderly, immunocompromised, or have multiple comorbidities. And as a result, you are going to effectively give individuals 2 chances to get vaccinated every year if you were to use the same vaccines. This is a good setup because you would, to a certain extent, remove the need, for the large extent, in providing boosters to COVID-19, because the COVID-19 vaccine would be for the most current strain, and importantly, it would provide the protection needed twice a year. So you have your very early 2020 to 2022 strains that are protected from the original vaccines, and every subsequent strain would be updated roughly every 6 months. Further to all of this, there is decent evidence, and to be clear, it's entirely observational, that those who had received reasonably regular influenza vaccines prior to the outbreak of COVID-19, and less clear-cut, the common cold or rhinovirus infection, were better protected against COVID-19 because the immune system was already, well, at least partially primed to deal with COVID-19, so their infections weren't as serious, weren't as long-lasting, and ultimately carried fewer side effects. This would, if carrying through to these dual vaccinations, indicate that vaccinating for both influenza and COVID-19 might provide a certain degree of greater protection, both for, well, both diseases. That is, protection to COVID-19 might better prime the immune system to deal with other versions of influenza, and vice versa. This all sounds well and good, but it brings us to unfortunate news, and that is, at least according to the University of Minnesota, it's still true that people are stupid. Not just stupid in that, well, they're dumb, but that 1 in 4 adults in the USA still believe the MMR vaccine causes autism. No. That's enough said. No. Okay, slightly more detail. The study was a survey, and so as a result it's always worth being a little bit skeptical. Nonetheless, 24% of the 1,500 adults who were surveyed said that the vaccine caused autism, which isn't good. The survey also identified other patterns which are honestly just as concerning because, well, it's not only full of bad information, but, well, factually incorrect information. Not just a misunderstanding, but factually wrong information. Not just is it an issue around the spread of measles, but obviously mumps and rubella as well. For example, the vaccine, depending on which particular one you're receiving, shouldn't be taken when you're pregnant, and for fairly obvious reasons. But the risks from this are fairly low. Admittedly, there is a risk, but still, it's a low risk, and therefore, as a general rule, people who are looking to get pregnant generally get vaccinated well beforehand. Importantly though, you only need that vaccination if you're planning to get pregnant if you weren't vaccinated as a child, which, with the growing prevalence of antivaxxers, is entirely possible and reasonable to expect to some extent. And so, when we come back to the original problem, that is, antivaxxers are spreading bad information that MMR causes autism, therefore parents don't vaccinate their children. Therefore, children grow up and become pregnant and need to get vaccinated, which does pose a risk during pregnancy if you get the MMR vaccine at that point. But if they get it a month beforehand, no problems at all. And it all comes down to bloody Wakefield and his stupidity. If we're going to look at things scientifically, the news out of Italy might be, on one hand, surprising and funny, but on the other hand, raises some questions. And it's why a statue of the Virgin Mary is not only weeping, but arguably the people are claiming weeping blood. It's not the only instance of this. After all, it's not an uncommon phenomenon to see various statues producing, to be clear about it, what is generally going to be found to be some sort of mineral leaching out of it. In many cases, it can be, quite literally, just a white crusty substance like you would see on bonsai pots. This isn't anything fancy or special, it's just minerals in the water, once the water evaporates off, being left as a deposit. But in this case, the statue is weeping something red, and the argument is that, the statue is weeping blood, which it may or may not be, depending on how questionable the statue is. If we assume that the statue itself isn't weeping blood, it could be anything. For example, it could be iron in whatever they've used to make the statue coming out when water leaches out of it. Different statues have different degrees of porosity, and in different places. So, for instance, if the statue is older and made from a less standardized material, it's entirely possible that there is iron included in the inside of the statue. And as water either travels up and is wicked up through the statue, it gets to the eyes where it finds an opening and is able to escape out from the material or the enamel around the statue. It's effectively finding an easy escape. But on the other hand, it could well be just a very simple example of a con artist. Somebody has literally gone and spread blood on it and claimed it's a miracle. Which, that miracles are just unexplained phenomena. There's no such thing, unfortunately. If they were, there's the expression, if wishes were horses, beggars would ride, or, alternatively, if wishes were horses, we'd all eat horse steak. And in either scenario, it explains that if miracles were actually real, in a manner of speaking anyway, that they wouldn't really be something that you could rely on, because something that is a miracle that occurs reliably ceases to be a miracle. The situation does get rather more explicitly clear when you look at what happened amongst the family that effectively owned the statue, and that is, the male family members refused to provide DNA samples for testing against the supposed blood on the statue, as it's claimed that it is actually blood. And this would indicate that, there's probably something more questionable going on in the background here than you might hope. And certainly not without reason. It wouldn't be the first time that somebody has deliberately chosen to, let's be unkind about this, deliberately chosen to commit fraud by putting their own blood on the statue and then claiming that it was weeping, and weeping blood for that matter. In much more scientifically sound things, we have the Great Texas Tarantula Migration. This one sounds terrifying, and if you're afraid of spiders, it would be, and especially if you live in Texas. But it's a phenomenon that occurs reasonably annually, and it's all down to weather conditions. The large spiders move through Texas, mostly trying to find their way around areas that are going to become inundated with water, and rather obviously, being walking spiders, they're going to get drowned, and spiders have figured out fairly early on, let's not be around when that happens. This leads to the tarantulas emerging from their burrows and moving away. The other advantage is that with the increase in rainfall and the increase in temperature, there are more insects available, which does mean that the tarantulas, in moving, also have access to more food, which does also promote the behavior. In what we can only describe as not scientifically sound decisions, we have Denmark recalling 3 particular Korean ramen brands and products for being too spicy. Now, this may come as a surprise to those in Denmark, but yes, that's what Korean ramen is like in many cases. The spicy. The reason Denmark has done this is that they claim the levels of capsaicin could cause poisoning. No, Denmark. Yes, you're famous for your cheese and other products, but surely you aren't this milk soft. The brands that have been recalled include Buldak with 3 times spicy hot chicken, the 2 times spicy hot chicken, and the hot chicken stew. All 3 were recalled because, Denmark is apparently full of soft people who can't deal with the spice. And Denmark's food agency has in fact, and frustratingly, in the current environment of inflation and food problems, encouraged individuals to literally throw away the food. The manufacturer has clapped back by claiming there is no problem with the quality of the food. You literally have recalled a product because it's too spicy. Yeah, this is like the worst case scenario for a food manufacturer where nothing is actually wrong with the product, but the regulator has recalled it because they just can't deal with it. It would be like recalling, say, corned beef because it's too salty. Yeah, it's meant to be salty. Or spam because, well, no, actually, the spam should be recalled because that is an abomination and should never be considered food. It does leave us wondering whether or not Denmark is going to start recalling things like sriracha or just plain black pepper if this is too spicy for them. Next we have what is honestly more of a conspiracy nutter news item, and it's older news now, but it was claims that Microsoft will disable your computer if you start sharing fake news. Now, first of all, no, Microsoft hasn't made such an announcement, which shouldn't be that surprising after all. Being able to remotely control someone's computer, and in this case particularly without their permission, would be considered some pretty major invasions of your personal property and likely illegal under a multitude of laws. Whether that is hacking laws, and something like the GDPR, that's your own personal data, and importantly, interfering with someone else's technology in this case, and any damage that might occur as a result. Further, a lot of the claims are based on something Bill Gates has said, but Bill Gates has effectively ceased being the person operating Microsoft years ago now. They still own a fairly large number of shares in Microsoft, but, well, they don't have any real power over Microsoft. And for that matter, Bill Gates has never said anything, but neither has the person who's in charge of Microsoft, that being Satya Nadella. Then we also have to ask, well, how do they even think that this is going to happen? And, well, as mentioned, most of the time, in order to have this occur, you would have to have some sort of malware or virus installed on your computer in order to give them that degree of local control. If you ever watched any of the anti-call center scam operator videos, you would see that in order to do this, you actually have to have a fairly invasive level of control over someone's computer. And that's just to fiddle with their screen and make it look like it's something other than what it is, let alone crashing it. And in the process of crashing it, well, in the end it leads to some pretty obvious results. You no longer have control over the computer, and you can turn it back on and more or less resume where you were with some stuffing about. And so it brings us to the final aspect of this, and that is the publication, The People's Voice, and currently named News Punch, is notorious for being a publisher of what is basically fake news. So, no, Microsoft is not about to start doing some weird and wonderful shit by being able to shut down your computer for sharing fake news. Ironically, the very same thing that the publication responsible for this is doing. In other fake news, of a kind anyway, we have something really funny, but also ironic and sad. Rasmussen Reports, one of the better known, let's say, right-wing polling agencies. They're particularly well known for their political surveys and similar. Has recently conducted a survey in which they analysed respondents' belief about the association of vaccines and adverse events, for example, death. Now, this in and of itself wouldn't necessarily be bad if, for example, they were trying to analyse the perception of people in terms of vaccine safety. Fair enough. But what they've done instead is extrapolate it out even further. Instead of saying this is what respondents have said, and obviously this is a misapprehension, they've taken it even further and said, no, these people are absolutely correct in what they've perceived to happen, and therefore vaccine's bad. As you can imagine, having published this on Twitter, they've basically been ripped a new one. And their defense to this is, a big pharma astroturfing contract is happening tonight. And then asking about where public surveys are that would counter them. No, that's not how any of this works. In fact, you could almost say that Rasmussen has fallen back on the anti-vaxxer defense of do your own research by claiming people should have public surveys. Surveys aren't evidence in this respect. They are a thermometer for public opinion, but they don't really produce data in the same way, especially when done like this. What we have instead is, data on the number of people who are alive at any given time, the number of people dying at any given time, and from this we can figure out if, for whatever reason, there is an excess mortality rate, and if we know that there's excess mortality, we can then look at, importantly, the availability of vaccines by location, population, distribution, so on and so forth, to figure out whether or not there is some sort of relationship between these multiple variables. Especially when they've designed what could only be described as truly terrible polling questions. For example, when they ask, do you agree or disagree with the statement about the COVID-19 pandemic? China lied, Fauci lied, people died. This is an already very clearly primed question to get certain people to respond certain ways, because you are looking at 3 different variables, if not 4, that being COVID-19 as a pandemic, China's involvement in this, which as we've already mentioned has been less than forthcoming, Fauci's involvement with this, who was the political figurehead, let's say, and people dying. Well, yes, people died during the COVID-19 pandemic, for simple reasons. COVID-19 was deadly. Fauci lied. Well, Fauci has openly admitted that he was more than a little misleading in some respects, particularly around the use of masks at first, but he's also explained the reason for that, which was to ensure that they had secured a stable supply for those who were frontline medical workers. And China lying, well, as mentioned. This brings us to the political alignment and the responses received. Just about everybody seems to believe that there is a lack of association between the COVID-19 vaccine and side effects. Admittedly, it does vary based on the political affiliation. Then, people dying in a household from COVID-19, the assumption that COVID-19 vaccines caused major side effects, and to a certain extent, the idea that COVID-19 vaccines caused death. None of these are valid arguments, simply because what they've looked at, in short, was not a suitable avenue of investigation, and with far superior avenues of investigation that found the opposite result to what they claim, their argument is basically scraping the bottom of the shit barrel and hoping to find nuggets of gold. All they're finding is very different nuggets. Moving to the negative side of research, at least, the side that makes it harder to trust some of that research out there, but particularly in China. It's another survey of sorts, it's interviews, it's the same sort of qualitative research avenue that found elite researchers in China claim they had no choice but to commit misconduct and therefore get their research published in order to keep their jobs. This is not necessarily a mind-blowing phenomena, but it's definitely a big scandal. The unfortunate reality is that China is notorious in research circles for being somewhat questionable. Depending on how skeptical you are, very questionable when it comes to research, and it's down to the fact that getting to the top of the pile in China in terms of academia and research is hard to do. In order to get there, you need to publish a lot of papers with a lot of very compelling results, and importantly, you need to keep doing that. The only way to do that is to do a lot of research very quickly and get it out there, which, to be clear, you're not going to get a lot of research out there unless you're finding a lot of meaningful results, which isn't how a lot of research happens. It takes a long time to not just get to where you need to be, but to refine your study to the point where the results are not just reliably obtained, but meaningful. That is, unless you go with plan B, make it up, or at least fiddle with the numbers to such an extent that, well, it doesn't matter what you actually find, suddenly it has meaning, such as with p-hacking, for instance. The interviews were with 30 faculty members, so basically 30 researchers, and 5 students, which are likely to be master's or PhD students, across 3 different universities. It gets really bad though once you start looking at what some of them admitted to. They quite literally were hiring services to make up papers for them. That is, they would falsify data, they would plagiarize, it would be written for them, and all they would do at the end is put their name on it as the author. In fact, in some instances, and rather disconcertingly according to the interviews, some of them will literally use services that will write a paper, generate data to match it, basically falsifying data. They'll plagiarize wantonly, and in many cases they'll offer none of this is good, a pay-to-be-added service. That is, you can basically invite any of your colleagues and say, I have written X, Y, or Z, do you want to be included as an author on this? Okay, give me X amount of money and you'll be on the list. And then of course part of that money is used to bribe the editors that accept these manuscripts, leading to a continuation of the same problem. Now, there are 2 sides to this argument, one of which is, well, all of it is the publish or perish mantra, and many universities require, if not outright demand, and punish you if you don't, certain levels of publishing achievements, that is, so many publications in X-level journals per period. This obviously leads to the pressure to do exactly this, along with actual real research. On the other hand, the argument is, well, not everybody does this. And so what? It's the highest level universities that tend to be least guilty of this. Understand at least guilty is a very big question, because they don't establish how widespread it is, but also the fact is there are more low-level universities, so you can think of it as a pyramid. Sure, the elite universities are at the top of the pile, but there aren't that many of them. The further down you go, of course, the more widespread this will be, because there are more staff and more academics who could be doing it. The response, or solution, so to say, at least according to one person, is let's set up systems to detect it. Well, why don't we just not do it in the first place is the obvious first response to that, but secondly, we've been trying for a long time to set up these systems, and it hasn't worked because it's damn near impossible. You can, to a degree, pick up plagiarism. Any university student who's dealt with the various systems that are intended to do that will tell you that that exists, but falsified data is much harder to detect, and it's much harder to prove. So, no, this is a big issue. In other Chinese news, we have somewhat dystopian and horrifying news. It's a factory in China that is making robotic dolls that have facial expressions. No thank you very much, simply down to the nature of what it is that they're going to be expressing depending on their use. And it's kind of terrifying. Either we have the maniacally smiling and laughing robots hunting us down to kill us, or the robots that have been through all kinds of hell, sad and lonely. And of course everything in between. These robots could be great for things like, for example, carnival displays, exhibits, whatever you want to use them for, where a humanoid expression could actually be helpful. For example, those clown toys where you throw a ball into their mouth and try and get it into the right column underneath. The carnival game. Yeah, it could be fun to have that. It could also be terrifying. At the same time, let's say sex robots, for instance. That's where things could get kind of awkward and embarrassing, let alone horrifying. To make these happen, though, they are a certain level of engineering genius. They involve many different small motors spread across the face of the robot, for instance, to move it in the right ways, to ensure that, for example, it can poke its tongue out, smile, and do all sorts of other things. The final news item we have for you is more a bizarre phenomena necessarily than an actual news item as such. It's the way that Taylor Swift fans are setting off seismic detectors, basically earthquake detectors, across various parts of the world. For example, in parts of California and England, where the crowds are being drawn in for her concert, and as they begin dancing, they are literally creating so much force that they can be detected 6 or more kilometers away. Quite literally, they are creating a force equivalent to twice the typical amount of noise detected by these detectors. And, well, if it's just a one-off event, it's bizarre, but sure, fair enough. But no, at just about every single concert, they could reliably and accurately predict where the concert was at based on how loud it got, or more accurately, how much noise was detected. The most extreme point being at the song Ready For It, where the amount of noise detected by the seismic detectors peaked. Admittedly, it's 144,000 or more individuals in each facility, so it's a lot of people dancing, not only rhythmically, but almost exactly the same time and way. In fact, it's not just the dancing, singing, and so on by the audience, but even the speaker system could be generating just as much noise. And honestly, just as much to the issues at hand. The overall phenomena is not necessarily new either. In fact, it's something that has occurred before. But overall, it's a bizarre thing to observe. And not just observe, but observe across the world in different places. The only thing you have to wonder about now is, are we going to wake up some sort of ancient beast that's been asleep for years and is pissed at humanity's attempt to, well, rouse it from its slumber? That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.